Over dinner, my father-in-law said loudly, "Don't forget who funded your start." He wanted my child to hear it. I didn't argue. I just finished my dinner. 3 days later, my father-in-law and my husband were shocked because my father-in-law chose the exact moment my 7-year-old daughter reached for her second bread roll to clear his throat and say, loud enough for the entire table, "Don't forget who funded your start." He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at Lily. The room went quiet in that strange way it does during family dinners, where everyone pretends not to notice something uncomfortable. My husband, Mark, kept cutting his steak like he did not hear it. My mother-in-law stared at her wine glass. Lily looked at me confused. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I just nodded once, took another bite of my food and asked Lily about her spelling test. The thing is, my father-in-law, Richard, loves reminding people that he invested $50,000 into my bakery 3 years ago. He says invested, but he treats it like ownership. At every holiday, every birthday, every random Sunday dinner, he finds a way to bring it up. Usually it is subtle. That night it was not. Lily asked, "Mommy, what does funded mean?" I told her it means someone gives money to help an idea grow. Richard smiled at that and said, "Exactly." Mark still said nothing. What nobody at that table knew was that the $50,000 had already been paid back. Every cent. With interest. It had been paid back 8 months earlier, quietly, through monthly transfers I made from the bakery's profits. Richard had insisted there was no rush. He liked the leverage more than the money. I finished my dinner. I helped clear the plates. I packed up the leftover pie I had brought. Before we left, Richard patted Lily on the head and said, "Always remember who helps your family succeed." On the drive home, Mark finally spoke. He did not mean anything by it. That is just how Dad is. I asked him if he thought it was appropriate to say that in front of our daughter. He shrugged and said we would not even have the bakery without his dad. That was the moment something settled inside me. Not anger. Not even hurt. Just clarity. When we got home, I waited until Mark went to shower. Then I opened my laptop and logged into a folder I had not touched in months. Inside were bank confirmations, contracts, and a document Richard had signed the day he handed over the check. A simple agreement. No ownership. No equity. A loan. I printed everything. 3 days later, both of them would understand exactly what funded meant. But that night, I tucked Lily into bed, kissed her forehead and told her that no one gets to rewrite your story if you are the one doing the work. She nodded like she understood. I turned off the light and went downstairs to make a phone call I had been thinking about for a long time. The phone call I made that night was not to a divorce lawyer. It was to my accountant. Her name is Dana, and she has been with me since the bakery was nothing but a lease and a sketch of a logo. She answered on the second ring. I asked her one question. If someone wanted to create the illusion that they still had financial influence over my company, even after being repaid in full, what would they need? She was quiet for a second and then said they would need access. Information. Visibility. That word stuck with me. Visibility. Richard never asked for dividends. He never asked for reports. But he always knew things. He would mention a new supplier I had switched to. He once referenced a slow week in February that I had not even told Mark about. I used to assume Mark told him everything. I was not so sure. The next morning I checked the shared folders for the business. There was a secondary admin email attached to my bookkeeping software. It was not mine. It was not Dana's. It was Mark's old email address. I felt something cold move through me. I clicked on activity logs. Reports had been downloaded regularly. Profit statements. Payroll summaries. Vendor contracts. Forwarded. To Richard. When Mark came home that evening, I asked him directly if he had given his father access to my financials. He said it was not a big deal. His dad just liked to stay updated since he helped get things off the ground. I reminded him that the loan was repaid. He said it did not matter. Family is family. That sentence told me everything. 2 days later I made another call. This one was to a commercial real estate agent named Blake. He had approached me months ago about expanding. I had brushed him off at the time because Mark said it was too risky and his father agreed. Now I asked Blake to show me the property again. It was a corner space 3 blocks from my current bakery. Larger kitchen. Better foot traffic. Half the rent for the first year because the landlord wanted a stable tenant. Blake told me there were 2 other interested parties. I told him I would sign by Friday. That Thursday, I transferred the final payment to close out the old loan officially through a certified document service, even though it had already been paid in installments. Dana prepared a formal satisfaction letter, stamped and notarized. I did not tell Mark. Friday morning, I met with the landlord and signed the lease for the new space under a new LLC. Sole owner. That afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with a small local investor group I had been quietly talking to for months. Unlike Richard, they did not want control. They wanted growth. Sunday came again, which meant dinner at Richard's house. I brought dessert like always. This time I also brought a folder. And I waited for him to clear his throat. Dinner started the same way it always did. Roast chicken. Overcooked vegetables. Richard at the head of the table like he was presiding over a board meeting instead of a family meal. Lily talked about a science project. Mark checked his phone under the table. I passed the potatoes. I did not bring up the bakery. I did not need to. Richard did. So, Vanessa, how are margins looking this quarter? He looked pleased with himself. He expected me to stiffen. He expected that flicker of irritation he liked to provoke. That I smiled. Margins are strong. Strong enough to make some big decisions. He nodded slowly as if that information belonged to him. I opened my bag and placed the folder beside my plate but did not open it yet. Then he said it again. Not the exact same words but close enough. You know, it is important for Lily to understand that success does not happen alone. Takes backing. Takes people willing to take risks on you. He raised his glass slightly in his own direction. Mark gave a small laugh. That was my cue. I wiped my hands on my napkin and finally opened the folder. Actually, that is something I wanted to clear up. I slid one paper across the table toward Richard. It was the notarized loan satisfaction letter. Beneath it were the bank confirmations showing every repayment with dates and amounts. Your loan was fully repaid 8 months ago. With interest. Here is the documentation. I just wanted to make sure we are all working with accurate information. The table went silent. Richard did not touch the paper at first. He looked at Mark instead. Mark stared at me like I had just announced I was moving to another country. You never said you finished paying him back, he said. I told you every month I was making payments. He blinked like that was new information. Richard finally picked up the letter. His jaw tightened slightly. You did not have to rush that, he said. I did not rush it. I honored the agreement. Lily looked between us. So Grandpa does not own Mommy's bakery? No, sweetheart. He never did. Richard's face changed at that. Not angry. Something sharper. Cornered. I continued before anyone could interrupt. And since we are talking about backing and risks, I signed a lease for a second location on Friday. We open in 4 months. Mark's fork hit his plate. He what? Kept my voice even. I expanded. I secured new investors. Professionals. They reviewed everything. They see long-term growth. Richard set the papers down slowly. Investors? Yes. Who approved that? I did. The silence this time felt different. Not awkward. Harsh. Mark pushed his chair back slightly. Why would you make that decision without talking to me? Because every time I tried to talk about expanding, you told me your father thought it was a bad idea. Richard leaned back in his chair. It is a bad idea. Expansion kills small businesses all the time. Maybe. Or maybe staying small so someone else can feel powerful kills them too. That was the first time I saw real shock on both their faces. I closed the folder and stood up to clear Lily's plate. Dinner was over even if the food was still on the table. What neither of them understood yet was that the expansion was only half of what I had set in motion. The other half would make this conversation look minor. The second location was not the real surprise. The real surprise was what I had discovered the night I checked the admin logs. After I found Mark's old email attached to my bookkeeping software, I did not confront him right away. Instead, I let Dana dig deeper. She traced login history, download records, and forwarding rules. It was not just access. It was strategy. Richard had been using my quarterly profit statements to approach one of my wholesale flour suppliers directly. Dana found the emails because one vendor accidentally copied the bakery's main address in a reply. In those emails, Richard introduced himself as a financial stakeholder and asked about bulk pricing for a future family-owned expansion. He was gathering numbers, testing margins, positioning himself. For what, I did not know yet. Until Blake called me 2 days after that Sunday dinner. You might want to hear this, he said. Richard had toured the exact same corner property 3 weeks earlier. Not for me. For a new bakery concept he was allegedly backing. The timeline matched perfectly with when he downloaded my annual projections. I remember sitting in my office after that call staring at the wall. It was not about pride anymore. It was about control. That Sunday night after dinner, Mark confronted me in the kitchen once Lily was asleep. "You embarrassed my dad." I asked him if he knew Richard had been pitching himself as part owner to my suppliers. He hesitated just long enough. He was just exploring options. Options to compete with me? "You are overreacting." I pulled up the emails on my phone and handed it to him. He read them twice. Still he said nothing about it being wrong. He only said he would never actually hurt us. That word again. I realized then that in his mind I was separate from that word. The next morning I met with an attorney named Claire. Not a divorce lawyer. A business litigation attorney. By Wednesday, cease and desist letters were drafted. One for unauthorized representation. One for misuse of confidential financial data. One formally revoking any past digital access and threatening action if continued. Thursday afternoon, those letters were delivered by courier. 3 days after that dinner, Richard and Mark were sitting in my living room holding identical envelopes. Richard read his first. Mark read his slower. "You are threatening to sue my father?" "I am protecting my company." Richard looked at me like he had never actually seen me before. "You would destroy your own family over paperwork?" "No," I said. "I would protect my daughter from growing up thinking her mother needed permission to succeed." Mark stood up. "This is insane." "Is it?" "You both watched him position himself to compete with me using my own numbers." Richard finally spoke. "Business is business." "Exactly." The room felt small. Heavy. Then I placed one more document on the coffee table. This one was not from Claire. It was from a divorce attorney. Mark looked at it and then at me like the air had shifted. "You are not serious." "I am." The expansion was not just about a second bakery. It was about building something no one could stand over and claim. And for the first time since that dinner, Richard did not have anything to say. Mark moved out the following week. Not dramatically. No shouting. No broken plates. Just 2 suitcases and a quiet agreement that we would figure things out. He went to stay with Richard. The irony was almost funny. What neither of them expected was how fast things would move after that. Claire did not waste time. Within days, my attorney filed a motion requesting a forensic review of all shared marital assets and digital communications related to my business. If Mark had forwarded financial data without my consent, it mattered. Not just emotionally. Legally. That is when things started unraveling for them. Dana discovered that Richard had used one of those forwarded projections to apply for a small business line of credit under a new LLC registered in his name and Mark's. The concept name was different, but the projected revenue numbers were identical to mine. Same supplier breakdown. Same seasonal assumptions. He had not just been exploring. He had been building. When Claire's office sent a formal notice to the bank questioning the legitimacy of the application's financial projections, the bank froze the pending credit line. 2 days later, Richard showed up at my bakery unannounced. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He asked what I thought I was doing. "Running my business." "You are destroying your husband." "I am correcting a boundary that was crossed." He said Mark was devastated. That I was overreacting. That family does not take each other to court. Family also does not use each other's confidential numbers to start competing ventures. He had no response to that. The next surprise came from somewhere I did not expect. One of Richard's longtime golf friends, Thomas, requested a meeting with me. I almost declined. Then curiosity won. We met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the bakery. Thomas told me he had been part of the informal investor group Richard pitched his new bakery concept to. He said Richard presented it as a generational family business that would eventually be passed down to his granddaughter. Lily. My stomach dropped. Thomas slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of Richard's pitch deck. My numbers were everywhere. Even phrases lifted directly from my website's mission statement. Thomas leaned back and said something I will not forget. "Your father-in-law is charismatic. But he is not the one up at 4 a.m. baking." He told me the investor group had backed out after receiving Claire's formal notices. They did not want legal exposure. Richard's expansion collapsed before it even opened. That weekend, Lily had a school assembly. Parents were invited. Mark and I both went. We sat on opposite sides of the auditorium. When Lily walked onto the stage for her reading award, she scanned the crowd until she found me. After the ceremony, she ran over and hugged me. Grandpa said you and Daddy are fighting about the bakery. I told her grown-ups sometimes disagree about work. She looked up at me and said, I told him you built it yourself. I did not correct her. 3 days later, Mark asked to meet. Not at the house. Not at his father's place. At my bakery. He stood near the counter while customers moved around us. Dad is furious, he said. That is not new. He said you humiliated him in front of his friends. The bank. Everyone. I wiped flour off my hands. He humiliated himself. Mark looked tired. Not angry. Just smaller somehow. He said he did not realize how far his father was going to take it. That he thought it was just brainstorming. I asked him one question. If his plan had worked, would you have stopped it? He did not answer. That silence was enough. The divorce paperwork moved forward quietly after that. But the real ending was still coming. And it would not happen in a courtroom. The real ending happened 4 months later, on the morning of the grand opening. The second location was brighter than the first. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A long marble counter. The smell of fresh bread drifting out onto the sidewalk. A small line had already formed before we unlocked the doors. A reporter from a local paper stood near the entrance. Blake had tipped them off about a woman-owned expansion story. I had almost said no to the interview. Then I remembered that dinner. Don't forget who funded your start. I agreed to the interview. Inside, Lily stood behind the counter with a little apron I had made for her. He was not working, just observing. She took the role very seriously. Mark showed up 10 minutes before we opened. He kept his distance, hands in his pockets. We were civil by then. Papers signed. Custody schedule agreed. No dramatic custody fight. Just a quiet ending to something that had been hollow for longer than I realized. Richard did not come. At exactly 9 we opened the doors. The morning rush was better than I expected. By 11 we had sold out of the signature sourdough. Dana hugged me near the ovens and said the numbers were already exceeding projections. Around noon, the reporter asked if I was comfortable answering one personal question for the article. Was it true that the business started with family backing? I could feel Mark listening from across the room. I answered carefully. 3 years ago I accepted a private loan. It was repaid in full. What built this company was consistency, staff who believed in it, and customers who came back. Simple. Factual. No bitterness. The article went live online that evening. The headline read something about resilience and growth. It mentioned the repaid loan in one sentence and then moved on to the expansion, the staff, the community response. Richard called Mark that night. I know because Mark texted me afterward. Dad is not happy about the article. I did not respond. 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. Richard's attempt to secure funding using my financial projections triggered a review from the bank's compliance department. When the numbers were questioned and the legal letters surfaced, it raised flags beyond our family dispute. Nothing criminal, but enough for the bank to permanently decline any future applications tied to that LLC. Word travels fast in small investor circles. The same people who once nodded along to his pitches stopped returning his calls. He had wanted recognition. Instead, he became a cautionary example. One Saturday morning, Lily and I were arranging pastries in the display case when Richard walked in alone. No announcement. No performance. He stood there for a moment like he was in someone else's building. I greeted him like any other customer. He looked around slowly. You did well, he said. I nodded. Lily came over and offered him a sample cookie. On the house, she said. He took it. For a second I thought he might try to reclaim something. Some credit. Some ownership of the narrative. He did not. He just said, I suppose you did not need my funding after all. I answered honestly. I needed it then. I do not need it now. He left without another word. That night Lily asked me why Grandpa always talked about money. I told her some people confuse helping with owning. She thought about that and then said, I want to build something one day that is mine. You will, I told her. The divorce finalized quietly a month later. No dramatic courtroom scene. Just signatures and a shift in direction. The first location remained steady. The second thrived. 6 months after opening, I was negotiating a third lease. Sometimes I think back to that dinner. The way Richard looked at my daughter when he said, Don't forget who funded your start. He wanted her to believe that power came from whoever wrote the first check. What she saw instead was her mother finish her dinner, say nothing, and then rebuild the entire board quietly. That was the only lesson that mattered.